Okay, with this video I'm going to show you how to build a jumper wire as your lab project. So you should get a kit like this in the little bag that'll have a section of wire, it'll have 2 alligator clips in it, and it'll have 2 pieces of heat shrink. And so what we're going to do is we're going to empty the contents out here, and we'll go to work. Now there's a couple of tools that you're going to need in order to do this. You're going to need some wire strippers. So I'm using these automatic wire strippers that work really well. There are less expensive wire strippers that you can use. We have those in the tool room. You'll also need some rosin core solder. Now there's two basic types of solder that we use, rosin core and acid core. You want to use rosin core anytime you're doing electrical soldering. If you're doing like mechanical soldering, like repairing a hole in a radiator or something like that, then you can go ahead and use acid core solder. But with rosin core solder, and sometimes you can't tell the difference, what's acid core, what's rosin core. Like for instance, if you look at this one here, the label's almost worn off of this one because this roll of solder I've had in my toolbox for decades. Anyway, all you have to do is just melt a little bit of the solder. If it smells like pine trees, it's rosin core solder. The other thing you're going to need is a soldering iron. Now I have a butane soldering iron here that I really like to use. And then there's also an electric soldering iron that you can use. And we've got tons of these electric ones in the tool room as well. And then for the heat shrink, you're going to need a heat gun. And so we'll use the heat gun to finish it all up. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, the first thing you want to do is make sure that you're on a surface that if you spill some solder or something like that, it's not going to hurt, it's not going to burn anything. So do not use the classroom tables for your soldering projects. This is best done out in the lab. I'm at my home shop right now, so what I'm using is I'm just using a piece of cardboard because the table I'm working on is a plastic portable table. And if I spill solder on it, it'll melt the plastic. It may burn into the cardboard a little bit, but it won't go through to the plastic. So the first thing you want to do is you want to strip the ends of the wire. And if you've never used these type of wire strippers before, you see there's all kinds of different holes, different sizes of holes. That's for the different gauge wire. And so what you want to do is you want to choose the hole that's about the same gauge as the wire itself, and you clamp it in there so it looks like this, and then you just squeeze and it pops it open, and it does a really good job of stripping the wire. What you want to do is you want to strip about a ½ inch off. So I didn't strip quite enough. If you look at that, it's not quite enough. So I'm going to strip just a tad more on it. So I've got about a ½ inch of wire showing. So that's better. I've got about a ½ inch of wire showing on this. And I'm going to take the heat shrink and I'm going to slide the heat shrink onto the wire, like so. And you want to slide the heat shrink down far enough that it's not going to melt or shrink up with the heat of the solder. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fit the alligator clip on the end of the wire. Now, if you notice on these alligator clips, there's a little screw on the back side. And that's because these alligator clips are actually made so that you can put a wire on the end of the alligator clip and just attach it with the screw. You don't have to solder, but part of this exercise is I want you to learn how to actually solder. So I'm going to loosen that screw, I'm going to put the wire up in there, and then I'm going to tighten it down around the wire. So I've got my screwdriver, I'm just going to loosen the screw. I'm not going to take the screw all the way out, I'm just going to loosen it, like so. And then I'm going to put the end of my wire into the end of the alligator clip and kind of feed it up through like so. And sometimes you kind of have to help it out a little bit in order to get it up in there. And push the wire up so that you can just see the insulation of the wire poking up through the alligator clip. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap my wire around the screw. So I'm going to back it out just a little bit more so that I can get that wire tucked right up around underneath the screw. You see how nice and even and tidy that is? And then I'm going to tighten the screw down. I don't have to crank it down really tight. I'm just going to tighten it down so that it's snug. Because you see it starts to pinch the wire back out. So that'll hold the wire in place so that I can solder it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this little device here. I picked it up at Radio Shack. You can get these things just about anywhere. But they're really handy for soldering projects because they can hold your soldering project in any position that you want so that your hands are free to actually solder. So I'm going to connect it right up there like so. So now it's all set, it's ready to go. So now what I need to do is I need to heat this up so that the solder will flow to it. One of the things you want to remember about solder is attracted to heat. And so what you need to do is you need to heat the metal up, this metal up right here. You need to heat that up and then dab the solder on there. So I'm just going to put a little piece of solder out there like that. So I'm going to heat this up, I'm going to dab the solder on there, and when this gets hot, that solder will flow right onto the wire and the alligator clip. It also helps if you use a little bit of flux. The flux will actually help the solder flow evenly, and it won't clump up as much. This is my flux. Now I'm using a paste flux. There's all kinds of different fluxes that you can buy. But this paste flux works pretty good for me, and I bought this, just to give you an idea, I bought this tin probably, I'm guessing going on 25 years ago, maybe 30 years ago. And I've still got tons of it left. So it doesn't take very much. All I'm going to do is I'm just going to scoop out just a little bit of flux like that on the end of my screwdriver. And I'm going to kind of smear it right here where I want to solder. So I'm going to get just a little bit more on there. That's probably too much. Scrape a little bit off. Okay, so I've got my solder joint fluxed. Now I'm ready to heat it up. I'm going to show you how to use the torch first, and then on the other end of the wire I'll use the electric soldering iron so you can see how you can do it either way. It doesn't matter which way you use as long as you get a good solder joint. But I like these torches because they're very portable and they generate quite a bit of heat. So to use one of these things, you've got two controls on it. This is an ultra torch, and the cost on these they're kind of expensive. A little torch like this is going to cost you probably about $120, but they'll last a lifetime. I mean, I bought this thing when I first got into the automotive industry, and you can see how well it's held up. It still looks almost brand new. But anyway, this bottom control here is your flame adjust. So you can adjust it from low up to high, and then this turns it on. So I'm going to turn it on, and then it's got a self-igniter. And you just pop it a few times until you hear that whistle. And once you hear it whistle, then you watch to see these little areas right here, that ceramic area. Once that ceramic area starts glowing red, then you know that your soldering iron is hot and it's ready to go. So what I'm going to do is I like to heat my soldering joints from below. So I just usually set the soldering iron right underneath my solder joint and just let it heat up. And so we're going to set it on there, and you'll see it'll start smoking here in a minute. That flux will start melting, and that means that I'm getting a good, nice, hot solder joint. Now for a soldering joint like this is going to take a fair amount of heat, so it's going to take a little bit to heat up with this torch. With the electric soldering iron, it won't take as long. It'll heat up a lot faster. And I'll show you that when we do the other end of the jumper wire. So I'm going to test it and see if it's hot enough yet, just by dabbing the solder right here. And I can also put just a little bit on the end of my soldering iron, and then just I'm going to try heating it up from the top right here. So I'm just going to lay some right here, and then just dab a little bit of solder on there, and just wait for it to heat up enough to start flowing onto the alligator clip. So you can see it's starting to now. It's starting to flow. Still not quite there yet, but it's starting to. There we go. There, I got a nice flow going. Okay, you see that? So now I've got a good solder joint there, and it looks nice and even. It's not all clumpy. It does look a little black because I did use just a tad too much flux, but not too bad. So that's my solder joint right there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to let it cool. So I'll turn off my my torch and let my torch cool down. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to put the heat shrink on there and shrink the heat shrink around it. So this is basically how you would do a typical wire repair. Is you do the solder, you solder it together, and then you would use a little bit of heat shrink to shrink around that. And that will weatherproof it. It'll keep it from getting corrosion and stuff from the weather. So I'm going to show you a little attachment for this soldering iron too. I've got a little a heater attachment on there that's really handy. Now when I'm switching tips off like this, when the thing is hot, you really have to be careful because you can burn yourself pretty easily. But I've done this enough years that I've gotten a method down where I can swap the bits out or the tips out without actually burning myself. So there we go. So what this is a little heater attachment. So you can see it's kind of hollow in the center. And what this does is when I heat it up, this works just like a catalytic converter does. And so I'm going to put my heat shrink up here, and then I'm going to turn my heater on and shrink up the heat shrink. So I'll just slide my heat shrink up over my solder joint, just like so. And then I'll turn on my heater. Whoops, got to turn it on. You hear that whistle? And then if you look right down in the side there, you can see how it's starting to glow red. This gets really, really hot. Right there. Yeah, I just burned myself. So you got to be careful with it. And then you just don't get very close to it, but all you have to do is just go back and forth, and you'll see the heat shrink start to shrink up here in just a second. There it goes. It's starting to shrink now. And you just kind of want to go around it a little bit until it shrinks all up. There is an attachment. I'm going to grab the attachment and show it to you so that you know that it's out there. Because my soldering iron was hot, my heater was hot already, I had to put this on with a pair of pliers, so I turned the camera off for that. But this is a little attachment right here, and it's a really handy attachment because you can go right around the wire like this, and you can shrink that up. And this is really handy if you need to put some heat shrink on in a wire harness and you don't want to burn the other wires. All you have to do is just go around it like that, and it'll protect the other wires. So if you have a wire that's really close by, it's not going to burn it. But that's it. So the heat shrink is shrunk up. And what you want to do now is, once everything is cooled to the touch so that you can touch it, you want to take a look at it and inspect it and make sure that the solder joint is nice and smooth. So you can see that. I'm going to wipe it off with a rag real quick, and so you can kind of see the solder joint a little bit better. But there you go. So it's nice and clean there. And then you want to tug on it and make sure that it's not going to come out. But there you've got a nice alligator clip right on the end of your jumper wire. Now on the other end, we'll do the same thing again. Only this time what we're going to use is we're going to use the electric soldering iron and the heat gun to do this. So again, I want to strip off about a 1/2 inch or so of material. And I usually like to twist the wires up so that they're nice and tight. And then this is the part you don't want to forget. Put your heat shrink on, because you won't be able to get the heat shrink on once you solder your alligator clip on. So put the heat shrink on, and it just slides over the wire. And you want to slide it down the wire far enough that it's away from the heat. And in the process of doing that, it looks like I moved a couple of the wires, so I'm going to twist those back up again. It looks like this wire has a little bit of string material inside the insulation, but that's okay. It looks like I don't have quite enough. I'm going to strip just a little bit more off of there, because I like to have a little bit extra so that I can go around that screw real easy. So I'm going to twist that up again. Then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put it in through, I'm going to loosen the screw on the back side of the alligator clip. And then I'm going to poke my wire up through the back side here. And then, like I say, you have to kind of help it out a little bit with the screwdriver to kind of get it to go where you want it to go. And there I've got it sticking up through the alligator clip like that. And then I'm just going to wrap it right around the screw so that it makes a nice, clean, easy connection, just like so. And then I'm going to tighten up that screw, but it only needs to be, you know, snug. It doesn't have to be really, really tight. Okay, and then I'll clip it back into my little holder. It's kind of nice because this holder right here, it's got another alligator clip here. So if you have two pieces of wire that you need to be held together, you can fix it so that this alligator clip will hold the wire and it'll hold the solder joint together. Makes it real easy for soldering. I really like this little guy. Okay, so now I'm going to flux it. So I'm going to put some flux on here so the solder will run really well. And looks like, so there we go. Just like so. Now this time I'm going to use the soldering iron. So this is the electric soldering iron. This has two settings on it. So on this particular type of soldering iron, this is my personal one that I bought years and years ago. But you pull the trigger in the first setting and you can feel the soldering gun come on, and that puts it on kind of a low setting, and then you can take it one more click and it puts it on a high setting. And so there again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get some solder ready, and I'm going to probably just use the first setting. I don't think I really need to go to the high setting. But just get that thing going, and I like to just touch a little bit of solder on the tip there, and that way I know I'm getting hot, getting ready to melt. So there I've got a little bit of solder going. And then just watch that solder to see when it starts to run. And when the solder runs, then I've got a good joint, or I've got a good thing going on here. So it looks like I'm getting close. There we go. See that? When the solder actually melts on the screw and you don't even have to touch it with a soldering iron, then you know you got a good warm joint. Looks like I got a little too much on there. A little too much solder, so I'm going to see if I can clean up that joint just a little bit. And I don't know whether you know it or not, but in most soldering irons, it's got a flat spot on the backside here. And that's so that you can set the soldering iron upside down like this, so you're not going to put the hot tip against something and melt it. So I'm going to set that over here so it's off camera. You won't be able to see it. And then I'm just going to let that cool a little bit until I can get my fingers on it. And once it cools down enough, it usually doesn't take really long, but it does It's still kind of warm. But I'm going to wipe the excess flux off there, because I put a little too much flux on it again. And see if I can get it to cool down just a hair. So there's my solder joint. I'll give you a close-up of it. So not the prettiest solder joint, but then again, it's not bad either. So it's cooled down enough that I can actually touch it. So I'm going to go ahead and slide my heat shrink up and around the base of my alligator clip. And I'm just going to slide it up as far as I can get it. And then I'm going to clip my alligator clip back into the joint. Now what I'm going to use a solder gun, a heat gun, and I'm going to use the low setting on it. This one here actually has a low and a high setting. The high setting gets really, really hot. So I'm just going to use the low setting on it. And all I have to do is just move the heat gun around it until you can see the heat shrink start to shrink up. There it goes. I'll do it on the back side here too. And that's it. This again has a flat spot you see on the back side here, so that you can set it upside down, and that way it doesn't burn, because the tip of this heat gun gets really, really hot. So you can just set it up like that, and that way it doesn't burn anything. And there again, I'm going to tug on it and make sure that it's a good solder joint. So there's my jumper wire. So now I can actually use this in my toolbox. A nice jumper wire that I can do electrical testing with, and it's real easy to make. Now if I want to do a fused jumper wire, all I have to do is cut the wire again and then solder in a fuse holder. And I have an example of that. Let me show you what that looks like. Now this is a jumper wire that I made years ago, and I made it a fused jumper wire. So what I did, instead of putting alligator clips on it, I put these spade terminals on there, so that way I can change the different ends on it. I've got a whole bunch of different ends that I made, so I can plug them directly into sensors and different things like that. But all I did with this is I went and bought one of these fuse holders that you can get at the auto parts store, and it comes with a pigtail on there, and I just soldered the pigtail to my wire, and then inside here I can put whatever amp fuse that I want. So if I'm testing a big circuit, I can put, like I've got a 25 amp fuse in here right now. But if I'm testing a smaller amp circuit and I want to make sure that I don't melt any wires or anything like that, I can put a smaller fuse in there. And so it makes it really, really convenient. All I have to do is just swap the fuse out and away I go. So the other thing you can do is with these fuse jumper wires is you can plug a circuit breaker in here and then use it as a circuit breaker tool. So that's another idea as well. Anyway, that's how you would do the solder joints and everything to make yourself a jumper wire.